This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Joining me now is Grady Miller, an American history teacher from Davidson Middle School in Hillsborough County. Grady, you are the social studies subject area leader. Tell us a little bit about what that means.
Well, basically, my job as social studies subject area leader entails trying to provide my department members with information that they need, trying to be the academic leader for the department, taking care of wonderful paperwork and things of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, it sounds like you do a terrific job, and I'm glad to have you over in Hillsborough County doing that kind of work for the sake of all of our students in Florida.
Thank you.
Anyway, Grady, we've got a whole list of amendments to talk about to the Constitution today. So where would you like to start?
Well, Dr. Fine, I was wondering if you could kind of tell me a little bit about what the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments have in common.
Well, what they have in common, Grady, is that they're all amendments to the U.S. Constitution, of course. And, you know, we can say that jokingly, but what that means is that you had to have both the, what we call a supermajority at the national level in Congress, and also a supermajority among the state legislatures in order to make that happen. So that's an important element that they all had in common. The other thing is that those are all 19th and 20th century amendments. None of these were amendments from the very, very early of the years of the founding, and that means that all of these amendments came in response to what was considered a national concern that was important enough to require an amendment to the Constitution, and that at least ostensibly, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a sec, and at least ostensibly then both the national government and the state governments came together on that. They say, well, why did I do that ostensibly stuff? Well, that's because when we look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those were all ratified between 1865 and 1870, the critical early Reconstruction years following the Civil War. And we really know that even though, indeed, the southern states did support those amendments, at least formally, informally they didn't. And they were really looking to get Reconstruction money from the government, and that was sort of the bargaining chip to get them to vote for these amendments. And so we know that even though these amendments are very strongly worded, that there were still a lot of problems and concerns that really for more than 100 years after the ratification of these amendments. But let me sort of tell you what they're about. The 13th Amendment says that there shall be, no slavery or involuntary servitude. And what's important there, Grady, is that when we're talking about that being an amendment, you might say, but wait a second, wasn't there an Emancipation Proclamation in 1863? Mm-hmm. Why would you need an amendment? Well, of course, because the only way to get an amendment out of the Constitution is with another amendment. Therefore, it sort of had more teeth than Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment defines citizenship. And in defining citizenship, it basically makes it clear that once a person is no longer a slave, they also have the full rights and privileges of citizenship, provided that they were born or naturalized in the United States. It also includes the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause as applied to the states. The 15th Amendment says that the right to vote shall not be deprived to a person based on past experience with slavery. So if a person is a former slave, they cannot be denied the right to vote. Now that was ratified in 1870. Over the next 95 years from 1870, what we've seen is, particularly in the southern states, all kinds of ways that particularly former slaves, the descendants of former slaves, and African Americans living in the South especially, had been denied the rights guaranteed under the 14th and the 15th Amendments. So, for example, we saw, well, perhaps not being deprived the right to vote, but being deprived the right to register to vote, unless an extremely difficult, almost impossible to pass literacy test was taken and passed under extremely harsh circumstances. Unless there was a literacy test that was impossible to answer. In the state of Mississippi, it was common for African Americans to be asked, and I'm talking in the middle of the 20th century, Grady, not right after the end of the Civil War, okay, really in the times that I know I've been alive, right, during some of these experiences, where in Mississippi you would be asked how many seeds in a watermelon, how many bubbles in a bar of soap. There's no right answer, right? There is never, ever going to be a right answer. So that wasn't denying anybody the right to vote. It was denying them the right to register, which was a prerequisite for voting.
Right.
So sort of the end of that, ostensibly, was the Voting Rights Act, the federal law enacted in 1965, right, 100 years after the 13th Amendment, that says that you cannot deprive a person of the right to vote, and this is what that means. And the term that we use for that is codified. The Voting Rights Act codified or put into legal terms and legal requirements what the 15th Amendment actually means. And the relationship is that certainly, unless you're a citizen, you can't vote, so that's 15th Amendment. 14th defines citizenship, and you can't become a citizen if you're a slave. So that's how sort of the three are related. It's not just that the post-Civil War, but they sort of one leads up to the other. But even ever since the time of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what we have found is that questions such as how does the districting of legislative districts at the state level and at the federal level, how does that impact a person's experience with their voting rights? Does it suppress some and advantage others? How do residency requirements, registration requirements, identification requirements, how do they, in some way or another, take away from a person's guarantees of their voting rights as found in the 15th Amendment and codified in the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Now, you asked me about some other amendments as well, and as I recall, it was, 19, 24, and 26?
Correct.
Was that it? Okay. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. What's that about? What's that about?
No.
Well, what that's about, Grady, is that the 14th Amendment is very specific when it says that it's talking about male citizens 21 or over. Okay, so there had to be an amendment to the Constitution specifically giving women the right to vote, or basically saying no sex discrimination in voting, because of the fact that the 14th Amendment, Section 4, is very specific to say that when we're talking about the equal protection of the laws applying to male citizens over the age of 21, and so there had to be an amendment, because when I said what's that about, what I'm saying is, well, wouldn't women be covered under the 14th Amendment? And they were specifically not covered under the 14th Amendment. And that was ratified in 1920. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time. And that sort of came about as a result of women arguing that they wanted to be supportive of the government administration, and therefore they wanted to participate in that process. But women were very specific in saying that they were not going to seek public office or seek some of the other advantages that voting rights have. When we're talking about the 24th Amendment, we're talking about an amendment that was ratified in 1964, relatively recently, and that amendment says that you cannot impose a poll tax as a condition of voting. And so it used to be the case that not only did you have to pay a poll tax in order to vote in an election, but you also had to post a poll tax for every election that you missed. So a very famous civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, for example, right? In order for him to get his voting rights in Mississippi, what he had to do was he had to pass a citizenship test, he had to pay his poll tax, and then he also had to pay the poll tax for every other year that he hadn't passed the citizenship test, right? And so he was very proud. In fact, if you go to his home, you'll find that his sort of registration card is there posted on the wall. It's now a National Historic Place. And then we also talk about the 26th Amendment that was ratified in 1971. And that was ratified in the midst of the Vietnam conflict. And what that says is that no state can impose that 21-year age limit, or age minimum, really, in order to be able to vote. Because some states allowed you to vote at 18, some older, none younger, but some were as high as 21. But in order to be drafted for fighting in Vietnam, you could be drafted at age 18. And so there was a lot of protest activity at college campuses all over the country at what seemed to be sort of a real conflict, that the people who were going off to fight this conflict and support the United States, they also did not have the right to vote for the Congress members who had the right under Article 1 to raise and support armies to send them. Because the average age of someone who was drafted in the Vietnam conflict was 19. So basically the motivation there was to basically take these sort of less formal methods of civic participation and funnel them into a more formal voting method. And the idea was that one would sort of get diminished as the political participation in the form of voting increased.
Right.
Grady, do you have any other questions for me today? This is so much fun.
I do. Out of the amendments that you mentioned, which one do you believe has had the greatest impact?
Oh my goodness, which one has had the greatest impact? Well, I would have to say the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, essentially by defining citizenship, essentially opens the door for all the other rights and all the amendments that follow, right? That by specifying that you have to be, born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. And it also says no state shall deprive you of your rights of citizenship under the U.S. Constitution. So what that does is it puts the states on notice to say, you can't have a state law that violates this person's rights under the United States Constitution. And please understand, Grady, when we're talking about rights, we're talking about the fact that the government has an affirmative obligation to protect those rights. Right. So therefore, the government is needed to step in order to protect those rights. Another reason why, in my view, the 14th Amendment is also the most important of those is that it's the one that's also had the broadest application. When we talk about Supreme Court cases such as Brown versus Board of Education, in terms of looking at that Equal Protection Clause, when we're talking about cases such as dealing with Korematsu, for example, and how the Korematsu case took U.S. citizens and put them into internment camps because they were of Japanese descent during World War II. It was that 14th Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court didn't agree with these Japanese Americans who were U.S. citizens, but nonetheless, at least it became an anchor around which to argue these issues. And so what we find is that I think that's sort of, if you had a bicycle wheel, that would sort of be the central spoke, the central axle, I guess, of the wheel. I didn't major in mechanical anything. Sorry about that. But that central axle and then the spokes around which it organizes. I'm wondering, we've got time for just one more quick question. Is there anything burning?
Yes. Out of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they were all ratified in a very short period of time. Why was that?
Well, because they came right after the Civil War, and the southern states really wanted money for Reconstruction. And also, one of the things that we find is that this was what many people might say is the most egregious, central, difficult crisis that the nation has ever faced. We talk about the Civil War. We talk about World War I and World War II. There's only been one Civil War, okay? There's been 2 world wars, and hopefully there won't be any others. But the idea, that commitment to making sure that it never happens again was really critical. And so they came in rapid succession because of the national crisis. Grady, that was, I think, a great question to stop on. And I so appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with you today. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We've been talking about the 13th, 14th, 15th 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and how those amendments impacted how minority groups have participated in the American political process. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.